an election in London in December 1832. In the early 19th centuries, elections were open. When an election was announced, a large wooden platform, called the hustings, was built in a public place. Candidates made speeches from the platform, and then the voters were asked to vote by a show of hands. No women, and only some men were allowed to vote. If the vote between two candidates was close, then a poll could be demanded. Each voter would have to go up onto the platform and prove he had a vote. He would then have to state publicly which candidate he supported. Often voters would be bribed to support a particular candidate. It was common for landlords who stood as candidates to threaten to evict their tenants if they did not vote for them. The passage below describes an election in 1832. The election for the borough of Finsbury took place on Islington Green. On Friday the 10th of December, the clerk came forward and asked all those who were not allowed to vote to depart from the green. Refusal to obey would mean prison, but as usual, no one paid any attention to the command. The clerk then asked the voters for a show of hands. He read out the name of a candidate and asked the candidate's supporters to raise their hands. He then read out the next name and so on. A reasonable number of hands appeared for Mr. Babbage, a greater number for Mr. Temple, and about the same number for Mr. Grant, a very few for Mr. Spanky, and a great number for Mr. Wakely. It is only fair to state that many boys and others who certainly could not be voters held up their hands. The returning officer, the official in charge of the election, declared that Mr. Wakely and Mr. Grant had been elected. Uproar followed this announcement. Many in the crowd claimed that Mr. Temple had a larger show of hands than Mr. Grant. Three candidates, Mr. Babbage, Mr. Temple and Mr. Spanky, then demanded a poll. The returning officer agreed to this. The results of the poll were declared on Wednesday the 15th of December, and the results were as follows. Mr. Grant, 4,278. Mr. Spanky, 2,848. Mr. Babbage, 2,311. Mr. Wakely, 2,151. And Mr. Temple, 787. The returning officer announced, amidst cheers and some groaning from the crowd, that Mr. Grant and Mr. Spanky had duly been elected. The Observer, December 1832.